A sword so technologically perfect in structure, so beautiful in creation, that it gave rise to an aristocratic warrior creed. Shimane in southwest Japan hides a place that still makes the metal for true katana swords. Kihara Akira is one of the last remaining traditional tatara masters in the world. He won't sleep for 3 days and 3 nights as he watches the furnace work on the dark materials for the world's sharpest swords. Compared to ordinary iron ore, the iron sand found locally is incredibly pure. It contains far less impurities like sulfur and phosphorus, which make iron and steel brittle. The magic starts when the carbon in the charcoal combines with the iron sand to form a unique type of steel. The Japanese call this raw steel tamahagane. It's a tense time as the walls of the furnace come down, leaving behind a blistering mass that looks like molten lava. It took around 26 tons of iron ore and charcoal to produce this crude steel they call tamahagane. If it's of the right grade, it could fetch around $50,000, which is around 50 times more expensive than ordinary steel. The furnace master, Kihara Akira, must now choose which bits are good enough to go to the sword maker. It all comes down to the carbon content of the steel. Too little carbon, and the finished sword could be soft. Too much, and it could end up brittle. The areas along the sides of the block where sufficient oxidation has occurred offer the best prospects.
One remarkable thing about samurai swords is none of the great swordsmiths could probably write down what it was about the composition of the steel he was using that was so good. But somehow they got it right, and so that, combined with the way the sword was used, set a standard of perfection that was to last for centuries.
Sakurai is home to one of Japan's most renowned swordsmiths, Gasan Sadatoshi, whose family has been swordsmiths for 800 years. But it's more than a profession. It's a spiritual way of life. They took their name from a holy mountain which they climbed to pray to Buddha before forging a new sword. Forging of this new katana will take 3 men more than 3 months to complete. Heat from the forge and constant hammering flatten the pieces into the building blocks of the new weapon under Gasan's watchful and highly trained eye.
I can see the amount of carbonization on the edges of these little pieces. This is very important when choosing the right pieces for the proper steel.
The selected pieces then get wrapped in paper and a light covering of clay and ash to prevent oxidation. Reheating to 1300 degrees centigrade prepares the steel for hammering, which welds all the pieces into one. They have to work quickly before the temperature drops, making the steel impossible to work with. The hammering also drives out any remaining impurities. The finished product will weigh almost 50% less than the raw materials. The embryo of the katana finally takes shape as a single welded block. But not until it is repeatedly folded and beaten to spread the carbon content more evenly will the metal for the sword really start to come into its own.
What this process of folding really involves is mixing the iron and steel so that the block is uniform, more or less throughout its whole structure.
All done by hand, the process is impressively accurate. The carbon content ends up at a more or less uniform 0.7% throughout the block. Ghassan gauges the concentration of carbon by the color of the steel. A dozen or more folds creates over 5,000 individual layers per 1 centimeter of steel. It is these layers that produce a pattern called the yihada, the skin of the metal.
The triumph of the Japanese sword maker is to combine iron and steel together. Hard material on the edge, more ductile material on the back of the blade. Toughness and hardness.
Two distinct qualities that make the katana among the sharpest and most resilient swords ever made. The blending of the two metals is the next stage in the process. The hard cutting edge, high in carbon, is made from steel which is wrapped around the lower carbon content, more ductile iron that forms the heart of the blade. A secret mixture of clay and charcoal powder pasted over the surface will insulate and protect parts of the blade during the hardening process. This insulation line, an art form in itself, is known as the hamon.
The clay is mixed with charcoal. I use it to bring out the line we call hamon. The creation of this line doesn't just show the skill of the swordsmith. It's also an expression of his creativity, and it gives every sword a unique character.
Where the softer steel core meets the hard edge of the blade, a clear line is visible.
Metallurgically, what this is it's a microstructural phase between the martensite and the pearlite that contains elements of both. And when the sword blade is polished, this can be seen as an area that doesn't take on a proper mirror finish.
Ghassan darkens the forge so that he can judge by the color of the metal exactly when the sword edge has reached 800 degrees. Too hot and the steel might crack. Too cold and the hardening would fail. Ghassan is ready to pull the sword at a moment's notice. Only when the color of the blade turns to the red of the rising sun is the katana ready to receive its soul.
When the blade's then heated to red heat, it's quenched into water, and those parts only covered by a thin layer of clay cool very rapidly and become very, very hard.
During the hardening process, the katana slowly comes to life. Rapid cooling along the edge, only thinly coated in clay, traps the carbon within the steel into a highly stressed state. This forms the sword's cutting edge. The main body of the sword, covered with thicker clay, cools down more slowly and keeps its more ductile quality. These structural changes during the cooling process bend the sword into its iconic shape. Master Honami is a 14th generation sword polisher, one of the most revered and respected in the world. He will undertake the third and final stage in the sword making process.
The polishing process was the job of a specialist, particularly in later centuries, and his task was to sharpen the sword, to give it its final shape, and also to reveal all the structures that were built into the sword during the forging and hardening process.
Every individual katana sword requires different kinds of special polishing stones. To select these, Master Honami draws on his encyclopedic knowledge of every swordsmith school in Japan. In the 14th century, there were 5 swordsmith schools. Incredibly, there are still 5 today. Good stones are rare and can cost thousands of dollars.